Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta charla magistral de la Escuela de Antropología. Es un hito que ya marca todos los años una actividad académica que espera concentrar un tema y una investigadora de relevancia para nuestra escuela. La escuela ya formalmente existe desde prácticamente una década, con la creación de la carrera hace 11 años, Antropología Social, en 2018 la creación del pregrado de Arqueología. En 2021 comienza nuestro doctorado, programa de doctorado de Antropología. En el año, yendo un poco más hacia atrás, 2013, comienza el Centro de Estudios Interculturales Indígenas. En el año 2022, el Instituto Milenio Biodemos. Y de esa manera la escuela sigue creciendo, desarrollándose y aportando al escenario nacional de la investigación antropológica. Sin querer quitar más tiempo en esta pequeña presentación, voy a dar paso a darle la bienvenida a Adriana Petryna. Ella es doctora en antropología por la Universidad de California, Berkeley, y profesora de antropología en la Universidad de Pensilvania, donde además dirige el programa de MD y PhD en antropología y el programa de pregrado en antropología médica. Con un foco etnográfico en Europa del Este y Estados Unidos, se interesa por la naturaleza sociopolítica de la ciencia, el modo en que diferentes poblaciones se integran en la producción de conocimiento experimental y lo que sucede en la ciudadanía y la ética en el intertanto. Reconocida por la proposición etnográfica de conceptos como la ciudadanía biológica o variabilidad ética, el trabajo de la profesora Petryna ha influido de manera decidida en los campos de antropología médica, la salud global y los estudios críticos sobre desastres. La profesora Petryna ha sido becaria Guggenheim y sus investigaciones han sido apoyadas por la National Science Foundation, el National Endowment for the Humanities, la Wenner-Gren Foundation, el Social Science Research Council y la School for Advanced Research en la Universidad de Princeton. Es autora de varios libros y artículos, entre los que se incluyen Life Exposed, Biological Citizens After Chernobyl, publicado originalmente en 2002, pero en varias reediciones también. Además, When Experiments Travel, Clinical Trials and the Global Search for Human Subjects, publicado en 2009, y el fruto de su trabajo más reciente, Horizon Work at the Edges of Knowledge in an Age of a Runaway, Climate Change, publicado en 2022. En relación con este último trabajo, el día de hoy, la profesora Petryna nos ofrecerá la conferencia Haciendo, horizontes, en los límites del conocimiento en una era de cambio climático desbocado. Por favor, recibamos a la profesora con un aplauso.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Felipe. It's a great honor and privilege to be speaking with you today. And thank you to Marcelo for working with me, and I'm so glad that we can be comrades in understanding fire. I'll be presenting insights from my recent book, Horizon Work, and offer reflections on the problem of what's called abrupt ecological change. Such change is often not subject to or does not always correspond to given ways of knowing or predicting rapidly changing ecologies. Here I refer to things we already know: intensified storms, droughts, and wildfires that are breaking out of known measures of frequency and spread. Projections and policies are faltering with respect to the pace of these changes, and often our heuristics, the way we know them, are insufficient for grasping them. How to deal with loss, how to even imagine the scope of loss. In his series of haunting seascapes, the Japanese photographer Hiroshi Sugimoto captures a crisis of response to this growing uncertainty. Yet with a closer look, his image gives, and the viewer takes in, clues. Tidal patterns, for example, gesture towards unseen paths that, if observed, might open up a time and space for deliberation, for movement. I will call this effort horizon work, and I want to show how it operates amid compounding catastrophes that threaten to overwhelm any human capacity to deal with their sheer volume. Nature itself has entered a runaway state in which shifts in established patterns and historical trends are more than a mixture of ecological surprise. They render the very concept of projection ineffective. It went so fast, said a resident of a town that was destroyed by torrential floods that overwhelmed the southern Brazilian region's flood alert system this year. You tried to do something, and it was already too late. Such words speak to the critical importance of addressing infrastructure for previously unimaginable volumes of rain, but also to the limits of such enhancements in environments that increasingly deny a chance of effective projection. So in this talk, I want to chart a course between the more apocalyptic images of irreversible climate change on the one hand, and conditions that might allow for re-entry into what I think of as a kind of negotiable present on the other. I want to argue that a mode of response often employed in public policies and politics denies us a foothold in felt and fast-changing realities. And today, this in itself may be contributing to a very rapid deterioration of how we know the future. I'd like to show how this deterioration is happening. And to do so, I'll talk a little bit about scientific evidence on how abrupt ecological change occurs, and then I'll bridge this with anthropological attention to how declines in understanding are felt and coped with, and specifically with the challenges faced by emergency service workers, particularly in the Western US where I worked. I'll also speak of the Amazon in Brazil, where fires in October reached their highest levels since 2007, but where there is still hope of finding a way forward. I also think of Ukraine, where I did field work earlier, and where fires and other carbon emissions from a brutal war mean necro-imperial devastation on a planetary scale. Across these deadly horizons and others, I'm searching for clues and strategies that will help to ensure livable or perhaps less ruinous planetary futures. But first, what does runaway change mean? And with regard to the fire epidemics in particular, how can our thinking not only analyze their perils, but also circumvent them? I began fieldwork on these questions in the US in 2015, which had been the worst wildfire year on record there. Fire seasons are now lasting almost 90 days longer than over the last 4 decades. The truth is that it's hard to find stability in numbers. As the future unfolds, those numbers of area burnt, of lives lost, of costs accrued for any particular year are becoming distant benchmarks of a runaway change. And over the period in which I had been doing this work, multiple thresholds had been crossed. All too often, there is no one left to recruit to fight the fires, as was the case this year. Well-defined fire seasons are just starting to be called fire years. Even prisoners are conscripted into response efforts. The US state of California sees mega fires in the winter, during what should be the peak of a rainy season. As one observer of those fires notes, I was expecting to see snow on that mountain, and now the thing is on fire. So in this process in which expectations are constantly undercut by physical events, this process takes me to the central theme of horizon work at the edges of knowledge in an age of runaway climate change. It's based on several years of ethnographic fieldwork based in immersions in scientific laboratory and emergency-related field settings. And here, drawing from that work, I want to offer some insights about what I think of for my purposes here in terms of a very basic World I, World II distinction, obviously not an exhaustive list. In World I, natural disasters can be contained and our projections hold. Knowledge is assumed to be cumulative, and to the extent that emergency services are available, they can be relied upon to maintain some sense of stability, and tomorrow, one hopes, will look like today. World II refuses to submit to that kind of control. The gap between what is predictable and what occurs grows much too large, and we fall into a chronic state in which only disastrous surprises emerge. Climate models have predicted how climate change will continue to cause havoc across the world. But these models are imprecise in terms of forecasting when or where the next megafire or superstorm will be. So in World II, projections degrade. Realities run away from received explanations and models, validating the idea of climate change as a kind of race against time. So if World I still exists for some, World II is already fully underway. And this is the one where emergency responders, wildfire scientists, fire managers, and other specialists I got to know do not have a luxury of pattern recognition. Their past experiences and knowledge are being rendered obsolete. All the while, as I'll show, they're trying to build up an understanding, a working understanding of World II. Here, they cannot indulge fantasies of certainty or control. Rather, they are engaged in a mode of thinking that considers disasters against a horizon of expectation in which they're still able to act. So, in World II, even as projections deteriorate, there is work to be done that can facilitate a kind of pragmatic reorientation towards less ruinous futures. Or as one scientist put it to me, quote, "We will need more knowledge of how not to break things even further," unquote. Taking certain actions that preserve rather than break the option of sustaining life means that we have to rethink not only infrastructure, but the knowledge bases that underpin such projects of self-preservation. So in the space of rapid ecological change, my inquiries took me to two interconnected fields. The first concerns ecological theorists and experimentalists who, over the last decades, have reckoned with large-scale ecosystem shifts and are attempting to define what they call critical ecological thresholds that, if crossed, may entail tipping points, irreversible change, and they are characterizing, if possible, what they call early warning signals for such changes. Such modifications can appear strange or anomalous at first. That wildfire season was long, but congeal into a new state of ecosystem organization. Wildfire seasons are getting longer. Their impacts start to be observed at region-specific scales. That mountain that should be soaked in rain or covered in snow, and thus resistant to fire, is burning. What leads from one stage to the next, in which the mountain burns in winter, is in fact a collection of missed signals, an invisible present that is reflected in what scientists call ecological regime shifts, defined as a rapid modification in ecosystem dynamics, leading to different and sometimes unfathomable ecosystems and states. These dynamics, these abstract dynamics, took me to my second anthropological field sites, where I focused on people who are making sense of these regime shifts, frontline emergency workers who are spending time going back to the basics of physical phenomena, like fire, that they thought that they once knew. They now find themselves in what one fire researcher simply called the upper limits of bad. In these upper limits, regime shifts are testing and dismantling existing modes of emergency response. Reflecting on this process, one firefighter put it to me in this way, quote, "We need to get out from under the expectation that fire control workers like us can be used to control nature, to suppress it, or tip it back." What I hear in his words is that meaningful references by which to improve knowledge or to measure progress in the race against fire are being lost. In such a race, the expansion of a deliberative space amid uncertainty and sometimes faulty knowledge becomes crucial work. Or, as his colleague put it to me, we need to acquire a horizon. Striking, as if this were a thing, a kind of lever to pry time from the kind of the onrush or onslaught of compounding disaster. Or as he put it, quote, "for deciding what we are going to do over the next week." Not like the next hour, this crisis mentality. But what I really mean is that we need to act in a way that we are not cutting off options for future generations, unquote. Options that include the option to adapt and to mitigate the harms of the climate emergency, the option of decreasing the chance of being continually blindsided by the frequency of disaster, and the option to act before the circumstances for doing so disappear. The loss of such options, such freedoms really, begins to characterize World II. I want to think about this sense of loss as a boundary where humans can no longer intervene in two ways. This is Bill Armstrong of the U.S. Forest Service. First, in terms of the limits of emergency response, particularly to wildfires that have themselves crossed some imagined tipping point, and where they are indeed now more hostile to human intervention. And second, in terms of how to build effective perceptual range, or how to forestall catastrophic conditions before such conditions refuse solutions of any kind. Such efforts, as you'll see, involve moving away from doomsday thinking, from inevitability, the point of no return that preoccupies so many, to capacity building exercises that see the future as recoverable. Within this particular horizon, how non-Indigenous, Western, and Indigenous knowledges relate to each other without marginalizing one another will point to crucial political transformations that must inform any safeguarding effort. And here, anthropology must enter into dialogue with processes that stand to overtax medical systems, threaten species, whole communities, and ways of life. In the various contexts in which I have worked, be it in the aftermath of nuclear disaster or in the context of the climate emergency, notions of adaptation and resilience abound. But their abstractions do not capture the experiences and losses that course through and indeed tear apart the traditional timescale of technocratic resolution. For example, no one could have imagined that the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster in 1986, whose aftermath I chronicled, would be caught up in a war zone more than 3 decades later. Or that a military would continuously shell the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. But it did. At the same time, crisis mode thinking can cloud imaginations of the future. Claiming every new crisis as unprecedented misses how anthropogenic catastrophes have already been visited upon indigenous peoples through colonial violence and erasure. Catastrophic thinking also runs the risk of what feminist philosopher of science Donna Haraway calls a surrender of the capacity to think. This surrender is also risky when an untested or desperate intervention begins to be sold to us as the only way to make an out-of-control problem go away. Here, I'm thinking of geoengineering, for example. It can involve the injection of billions of sulfur dioxide particles into the atmosphere, producing chemical clouds that reflect sunlight and cool the planet. But there isn't, and likely will never be, enough control to deal with the potential adverse outcomes of this planetary experiment. Arguably, the suppression of wildfires, the fighting of wildfires, in the US at least, where huge amounts of money are spent to tip nature back, falls into this class of technocratic and I would say even quasi-militarized efforts towards nature's stabilization. Proposals that now include bombing wildfires into submission underscore how deeply assumptions about fighting wildfire can run. Cognitive dissonance is no way to adapt to the climate, let alone any emergency. Aggressive technical fixes obscure the question of how to collectively coordinate to produce more stable fire regimes, for example. And while dissonance or nihilism can feed a distorted, what I think of as a kind of distorted picture of inevitability, I hope to convince you that even as climate change is a foregone conclusion, at least for the foreseeable future, the conditions that make fire burn catastrophically are not. This retreat from catastrophic thinking falls into a kind of activity that I've come to call horizon work, which is both an intellectual and practical labor that attempts to bring an unknown or runaway future into the present and to turn it into an object of thought and intervention. Such work is an imaginative exercise first, one that is not limited to experts alone, and one that entails not only grappling with present and near future regime shifts, but also of retrieving horizons, desired future conditions, and of bringing them to bear on the present where knowledge can be made actionable and not obsolete. To explore this looming edge a little bit more, I want to invoke this somewhat iconic curve in the ecological sciences. This is the so-called regime shift curve, and I want to draw your attention to the bottom two-dimensional piece of this drawing, noting that what you see above corresponds to what you see below. And looking at that bottom drawing, let's say that the line that is running to point F2 represents some stable, unchanging state, a stable ecosystem, for example. But depending on the amount of pressure or perturbation, say from greenhouse gas emissions, that ecosystem can lose stability. When it is pushed past some threshold, usually referred to as a tipping point right at F2, it free falls along that dotted line to F1 and into what is called an alternative stable state. Note that that free fall along the dotted line suggests that the damages to an ecosystem that was tipped or flipped cannot be reversed along the same path that those damages were created or perpetrated. Dominant forms of expertise will become inadequate, perhaps even futile for such an endeavor, which suggests that response cannot be left to one set of experts, but must be undertaken by an array of knowledge holders. Indeed, regime shifts, again, these are fast makeovers of ecosystems with potentially permanent effects, exist at every register of life, from the chemico-physical to the ecosystemic, from the mundane to the downright alarming. On the mundane side of things, a lake looks normal one day, but it is smothered in thick algae the next due to high levels of phosphates from agricultural pollution. Here's another example. One day everything seems normal, perfectly calm. The next day, fish underbellies cover the lake as far as you can see. At smaller scales, once a lake is over a critical threshold or tipping point, massive fish death like this can result. But at larger scales, the notion of tipping points implies much more clarity than even scientists actually have. Carbon dioxide emissions, rising temperatures, and biotic shifts do not share a single threshold, and many ecosystems do not or may never have convincingly established tipping points. One can imagine instead what is a messy vastness of causally intertwined possibilities making up a broad, undulating border of tipping points that is more like a cliff. Here, a stable Earth system can be tipped into that of a hothouse Earth and into a profoundly different biosphere in hotter climatic conditions. Such sudden shifting highlights problems of projection into futures to come. And as questions of stabilization grow urgent, asking how far or close or beyond we are with respect to tipping points may seem futile. However, many would argue that knowledge of tipping points is politically useful. It highlights the ever-increasing costs of inaction. As two prominent climate scientists wrote, referring to an Amazonian tipping point and the need to stop deforestation, quote, "There is no point in discovering the precise tipping point by tipping it," unquote. Catastrophic loss is never an abstraction, and it's not an abstraction for Sandra Guato Silva, a community leader in the vast Pantanal, the planet's largest tropical wetland, which lost a third of its biome to fires in 2020 and even more this year. She told a journalist that she mourns the loss of nature itself. Quote, "It makes me sick. The birds don't sing anymore. I no longer hear the song of the Chaco chichalaka bird. Even the jaguar that once scared me is suffering. That hurts me. I suffer from depression because of this. Now there is a hollow silence. I feel as though our freedom has left us." North of her, 20% of the Brazilian Amazon has been deforested since 1970. Logging and rancher-set fires burning out of control in changing climate conditions are threatening another 20%. At 40%, and as precipitation decreases, the forest can be lost forever. In the early 2000s, a coalition of political and scientific actors pulled the Brazilian Amazon back from the brink. They did so by imposing moratoria on soybean and cattle industries. They used satellites to spot instances of illegal logging or burning. Scientific agencies worked with the judiciary to create a sophisticated deforestation alert system, strengthening environmental enforcement and commodity supply chain traceability, holding perpetrators and sellers of deforested land products accountable. They also strengthened and helped demarcate territories where indigenous peoples and other threatened communities continue to be the guardians of the forest, even as they have confronted or postponed the end of the world and the disappearance of their life worlds many times over. As Ailton Krenak, a philosopher and Brazilian indigenous leader of the Krenak tribe, writes, and as they are losing their leaders to ongoing violence today. In other words, it was coordinated acts of stabilization such as these, based in political will, technical expertise, and guaranteed territorial and human rights that between 2004 and 2012 allowed Brazil to reduce deforestation in the Amazon by an astounding 80%, making carbon dioxide emissions from deforestation fall by almost 60%. With such coordinated capacity building as an important example of what I think of as horizon work, let me now turn to the issue of intensifying wildfires and to efforts to align response with the scope of the challenges ahead. Over the past recent years, boreal forests just south of the Arctic Circle have gone up in flames. Siberian wildfires regularly unlock extreme pollution from carbon-rich soils. In Brazil, parts of the Amazon, typically an absorber of carbon dioxide, are turning into a source of those emissions. The precise contribution of wildfires to planetary emissions and the related degree of warming is not known. Given the magnitudes of peril that are built in but hard to quantify, defunding fossil fuels and holding global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius is more critical than ever. But beyond important target setting, what kind of response can confront the ongoing damages? This somewhat dystopic image continues to give me pause. It's of a Greek wildfire fighter wearing an aluminum heat-resistant uniform that invites us to reflect on responses to a highly combustible world, with what kinds of resources, human and otherwise, and with what kind of knowledges and practices. To see the issues at play, let me go to California once more, where the massiveness of the problem is matched by the most enviable amount of resources. We actually see small towns that pop up around wildfire fighting or wildfire suppression sites. Beyond the effects of stagnant wages, high stress, long hours, increased fire activity, all these things that have had so much, given so much hardship to people doing the hard physical labor of suppression, fire is also a mental health crisis. The suicide rate among wildfire fighters is markedly higher in the US than the US national average. And there is an additional paradox at play with respect to fire, at least in the US, that the more it is fought, the less it is known. In this last section, I want to speak to this paradox and then engage other modes of contending with diminished ecological futures. So in my work, I discovered that a long-standing focus on fighting wildfires, on fire suppression, especially after World War II, meant that the science of wildfire had been fairly underdeveloped. It was limited to kind of an image of how fire should behave in the field, that is, to an image of controllable wildfire. Cold War ballistics experts who once dominated a small field of US wildfire science created, and in some instances, created what some scientists called hypothetical universes, where fire is assumed to spread in some steady or predictable fashion. But of course, it's the non-steadiness, it's the excursions that allow fire to spread. And by erasing this dynamic feature of fire, such hypothetical universes had effects in the field. They built faulty intuitions in firefighters. They reinforced images of fire that themselves could prompt serious misjudgment about their behaviors. The philosopher of science Gaston Bachelard was onto something when, almost a century ago, he pointed out in his book, The Psychoanalysis of Fire, that certain entities like fire can outpace the techniques used to understand them. Fire, he wrote, is no longer a reality for science. Today, these scientists suggest that the models are so flawed that bodies themselves become highly dubious instruments for apprehending risk. That is, the sensory apparatus of firefighter bodies in the US that relies on heat, for example, rather than other signs to interpret fire's danger, can produce its own kind of error. So I want to show you a clip from the lab that underscores some of these points, and you'll see that what happens in between the peaks of fire and the dynamics inside the flames, called convective dynamics, is critical to understanding how wildfire moves.
We don't understand the physics of how fire is able to go from where it's burning now to where it is yet to burn. Because flames are hot, they want to rise. Well, rising goes vertical. How is it that we get a horizontal force there to allow the fire to spread? How is the heat transferred?
So what's interesting here is that he basically is saying that we don't know how wildfire spreads. So firefighters look at fire from, to interpret its behavior, they use heat, their own body to sense heat, or they look at the height of the wildfire, for example, but they don't look inside the wildfire itself into these dynamics that he was talking about that create these horizontal forces that make fire move. And why is this important? Coordinated fire management anywhere depends on what we might think of as a shared mental image of fire, right? How fast or slow is it moving? In what direction? As changing conditions are more acutely felt, issues arise as to whether humans, at least in the US, are becoming ever more ill-fitted to fast ecological change, to actually understanding it and responding to it, about whether we can all even see the same fire. So these issues become really important in life and death moments in the field. In the US and increasingly around the world, we see wildfire fighters using using pop-up shelters. So they're relying on these pop-up emergency fire shelters when they realize that they will be overcome by fire and they need to take cover. This is a life and death issue. The ones pictured here were originally encased in a protective aluminum that reflected heat. They are prototypes and no one is in them, thankfully. Propane flames, meant to mimic the high-intensity fires of today, actually melted the aluminum and exposed the heat-resistant cloth inside. Engineers working in fire recently tested materials from the main US space agency, NASA, materials that thermally protect spacecraft upon atmospheric re-entry, to see if these materials functioned any better than those that are currently in use. But unfortunately, the NASA materials did not hold up well against fire temperatures here on Earth. Lives are at stake. Wildfire trainers are rebuilding what they call situational awareness. Only this time, they have to change basic intuitions about fire. For example, they'll tell firefighter trainees to throw away their what they call old mental slides of fire, a term they use to refer to slides that were once informative guides to fire behavior. But today, trust in patterns is its own occupational hazard. And overcoming such hazard may not be a matter of better, fast thinking. This is a model of expertise proposed by the late behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman, in which expert knowledge is said to accumulate through repetitive practice within relatively stable environments. Indeed, the given mental slides of fire today may no longer even be relevant to the physics of what is actually happening. One firefighter likened the futility of fighting some wildfires with trying to fight a hurricane, like trying to fight a hurricane. I came across this strange comparison often in my interviews. Frustrated by the pressure to fight fires exacerbated by climate change, one firefighter told me, quote, "We don't get out in front of hurricanes with fans trying to change their direction, right? We don't get out in front of tornadoes trying to turn them around," unquote. So where knowledge is assumed to be cumulative or honed by repetitive experience, it is in some ways diminishing as a symptom of there being a profound mismatch between method and circumstance. In the US, this diminishment can be appreciated historically. For example, the main US firefighting agency, the US Forest Service, touts a 98% success rate in stopping fires with aggressive action. But that success rate of 98% has not changed from the early 20th century when large-scale fire suppression was first introduced. Back then, firefighting worked because indigenous fire management practices of active burning, a product of over 10,000 years of fire use across ancestral territories, made it easy to have this very high success rate. Today, firefighting has made the land far more combustible, burnable, providing more fuel for fire hurricanes to evolve. California has the biggest military firefighting force in the entire world, and they still have some of the worst fires. Yes, there's something wrong with this picture. In remaining moments, I'll point to a required reckoning with colonial history and then conclude with more general thoughts on the theme of horizon work. Indeed, fire is haunted by a settler colonial time. The logics of control of wildfire, imported from Europe and adopted in the US for destructive commercial extraction, such as logging, has been part of what indigenous geographer Laura Harjo calls, quote, the eliminatory work of the settler colonial state. Such work involves the exclusion of indigenous knowledge and relations in lands that were once shaped by fire behaviors that were made to occur reliably across millennia. Tree rings provide the usual go-to evidence here. And I want to draw your attention to the darkest area on the cross-section of this particular tree stump, which is of a 400-year-old ponderosa pine from the western US. And so this burned area indicates constant exposure to fire. So low intensity, high frequency fire about every 10 to 15 years. Tellingly, that area representing fire's continuous presence stops right here at around the year 1900, when firefighting, this kind of heavy fire suppression, was introduced, and the cross-section turns a steady beige, or dare I say, invoke the color orange. Prior to that moment, that tipping point, fires crafted microhabitats for diverse plants and animals. And these variable microclimates could in turn reduce the severity of fires. Preventative burning made landscapes fire adaptive, and fires were safer for people to engage. One fire manager of a forest in the state of New Mexico, where I also do field work, got the state's permission to enact one of these burns, one of these so-called cultural burns. And he described to me with pride the fire he helped start. He said it was like a beautiful, docile animal, curiously wandering about in the forest. Rather than demolishing everything in its path, its creeping tendrils slowly coiled through mosaics of rocks and rocky mesas and drainages. He expressed joy in the fact that surrounding communities didn't even know that there was an actual fire going on. And here you are seeing how fire is being returned to the land. In addition to the work of fighting fires on their reservation, the Flathead, the Salish Kootenai tribes of western Montana, northern United States, bordering with Canada, they burn a considerable amount of land every year, and it's a way of reclaiming their land. By putting fire on their land, they're reoccupying lands that have been, in a way, occupied by this settler colonial kind of fire. Historically, fine-scale practices like these could achieve stability within dynamic environments that include breathtaking mountains rising, English units, 10,000 feet in the northern Rocky Mountains. I see a t-shirt there, Rocky Mountains. Excellent. So stable were the outcomes of these fire experiments that the Salish Kootenai people, rather than being afraid, actually welcomed the lightning that caused fire. So here we could say these are indeed gifted geoengineers, right? Such outcomes are comprised of real relations among humans, non-human, and more than human beings. Today, indigenous applications of fire as medicine are still too few because tribes, at least in the US, are still subject to settler colonial restrictions and bans. They can't burn. Yet other fire futures are already underway. And here you could see among the Karuk tribal crews igniting cultural burns, again in California, during a training and exchange program. Today, no doubt, firefighting and the resources to support it are critical. But the methods of response should also align with the circumstances. So I'm arguing for a different social labor around crisis, one in which there's not one class of sacrificial fire control workers, but many kinds of knowledge holders that make sense of ecological complexity and that can help shape fire's future evolutions. As more carbon dioxide is pumped into the atmosphere and we've reached even higher peaks, the bigger question here is, what would it mean to break from a path of inevitability with our forests, oceans, and lives intact? There are many ways to answer this question and to enact horizon work, or some form of it, in ways that do not reproduce the logics of colonial control or what Italian anthropologist Ernesto Di Martino called self-sabotage. This is also to say that horizon work can make fire real, in other terms, not just as a quasi-military adversary or as an unstoppable force of nature, but as the stuff of reimagined political responses and objectives. In exploring climate futures in terms of horizoning, I shifted the focus from inevitability, a dreaded point of no return that preoccupies so many, to exercises in capacity building that present the future as somehow recoverable. Just as the climate is changing and expectations for how the environment should act are constantly being shattered, so too are efforts to maintain a basic capacity to respond to future shocks. So here, at least, acquiring a horizon means changing expectations around wildfire control. It means revising knowledge calibrated to conditions that no longer exist. It means facing the fact that the circumstances for responding to disaster may themselves be shrinking or disappearing. Acquiring a horizon also entails commitments, various commitments to safeguarding what hasn't been lost. With projections less than reliable, it means acknowledging the scales of accumulated peril that exist below thresholds of science and scientific perception. But also in this knowledge void, where projection fails, we can in fact find spaces to reimagine the scope of collective action. So here, horizons become instruments, less metaphorical, more like instruments, helping us to carve out effective potential, perceptual range. Seafarers, especially in a dense fog or storm, have a special ability to grasp the kinetics of real danger. They demarcate increments using known parameters, perhaps a smell or certain patterns in tidal waters, and they deduce their position vis-a-vis previously estimated locations. This is not a technical fix, but a continual capacity for recalibration, a form of work that makes good on incomplete information, allowing movement forward or preventing a crash or disappearance of an entire system, be it a boat, a lake, a forest, or a world. Rather than capitulating or running toward fear, horizoning becomes a way-finding navigational tool that plumbs the lines of a durable world. Those lines run straight through violent colonial legacies, misguided policies, and ongoing structural inequalities that place traditional and indigenous communities on the front lines. They run through the extractive regimes, generating massive transfers of risk that overdetermine who is protected and who is sacrificed. Somewhere along this way, it won't be technical fixes like geoengineering, but rather coordinated acts based in political will and collective responsibility that can reverse increasingly unlivable planetary conditions. When destructiveness obliges us to revise understandings calibrated to conditions that no longer exist, making horizons beyond which the world as we know it disappears, is also an exercise in delimiting noble, more just, and livable worlds. Thank you.
Para preguntas. Quería preguntar sobre el concepto de crisis, en particular porque la invisibilidad y la escala del fenómeno de los incendios actualmente hace que no haya mucho vínculo con dos imágenes típicas de la crisis. Por un lado, manejo de crisis management, con su trasfondo tecnocrático, y por otro lado la conexión con el concepto de crítica, crisis crítica. Quería preguntar si es un concepto que, cómo es pensado desde los lugares de trabajo, los field sites, en los dos que mencionó, y si estamos en búsqueda de un nuevo término para entender nuestra relación con el cambio climático o crisis climática.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. So, I'm trying to push back on this more technocratic idea of crisis. I don't think there are answers. Even today in the New York Times, there was an article that said that experts can't keep up with the crisis. At the same time, I'm on a WhatsApp group of volunteer firefighters in Pará, in the state of Pará, who are mobilizing forest brigades, firefighting brigades, because they need help. I was watching somebody who needed the help, who didn't have the help, put out a fire himself in his aldea last night. And the scale of destruction for him was a crisis, but it's an unseen crisis. These are people who are living in what we might call a fire poverty trap, small-scale farmers who are dealing with the crisis of small crises, escaped fires everywhere because of the drought. The second year of the drought has poured gas on his village. But this is a crisis that he still hasn't eaten from, and he's not getting the resources and the tools to help him. So I think we do have work to understand life continuing in spite of these crises, and to decenter the conversation from these larger pronouncements.
Eso sí. Muchas gracias. Quería hacer como dos preguntas. Una, si podría hablar un poco más sobre cuasi militarización que hablas, porque, bueno, también soy de Estados Unidos y hablamos de la guerra contra las drogas, la guerra contra el terrorismo, la guerra contra la migración y también esta idea de la guerra contra los incendios. Trabajo en Mato Grosso, acabo de pasar por Pará, también se está hablando en Brasil de una guerra contra los incendios, y eso es un lenguaje que es transversal a cualquier régimen político. Entonces, en Bolsonaro se habla, en Lula se habla, en Estados Unidos, ¿cómo se ve ese tipo de postura? Y la otra pregunta, aprovecho de preguntar de un ejemplo del libro en donde habla de un pueblo en California que se quemó entero. Las casas se quemaron, pero quedaron verdes los pinos arriba, y me interesa escuchar más sobre esas confusiones de causalidad, ¿no? Con incendios, y qué efecto ves eso como de forma más transversal en el trabajo.
Sí.
Gracias.
Yeah, super. Thank you so much. Can I start with the second question, because I have conveniently an image of that. I have it here. So this is the question. The second question has to do with a fire that came through a community in Northern California and burned it down like this. And so what you're not seeing are tree plantations that are near this town that created the conditions for the fire to spread very quickly because of the regularity of the planting of the tree plantations. And also what you're noticing here, talk about causality and confused causality, is you're not seeing a wildfire here. You're not seeing a forest fire. You're seeing a structural fire. You're seeing houses that are burned down. But this fire is often called the wildfire. And so, yes, as you asked, the trees are still standing. So it means that the temperature of the fire wasn't hot enough to burn this live vegetation. And so the problem is with structures. And so these are people, a lot of them low-income people who lived in this town that lacked an exit. And the way that fire moves through structures like these, and these were apartment blocks that were next to each other, is that the sparks, they go into the ventilation of the homes. So they come inside, and then they blow up the roof like that. And then one roof blows up, and then it goes into another one, and another one blows up. And so it's like that. That's what happened here. it wasn't a wildfire, but it gets confused. So these are human actions that, I mean, more than human, multiple errors, multiple causes to this event that burned this town. So, but that differentiation of cause is very important. And then also in terms of the quasi-militarization, well, it is kind of like the militarization in California at least. You know, people want the protector. They want people to come and to protect them and to save them. And a lot of my work has to do with breaking down that distinction between the rescuer and the victim. You know, like the volunteer fire brigades that I traveled with said, we're all brigadistas, you know, we're all brigadistas. Even after a forest fire happens on our land, the Tucanos are brigadistas because they're the first ones to go to plant seeds in the burned forest to help it grow back, or something else to grow back. So we have to pluralize this notion of who the fighter is. And of course, the response to the fires, I didn't show the graph, but in Brazil, if we were to make a comparison by countries in Latin America, the graph, I mean, Brazil's graph is just off the charts, so many fires, and so many different kinds of fires in many different biomes. And so the response by the government has been quite confused, I think. I think most people would agree. And, sorry? Oh, thank you. And so typically the solution would be to, you know, politically kind of weaponize this idea of the fight, right? And of course, there aren't enough resources even for that fight, you know? I mean, the people that I just talked about now, they don't have enough resources. I mean, in entire biomes right now, you know, as you know, probably, can go up like this. So the scale of the urgency is much different now. So Brazil has been very effective in mitigating deforestation through the deforestation alert system. This year, I mean, even, I guess, after Bolsonaro, I mean, it's terrible. The deforestation rate went down, but I think it would have gone down anyway because Bolsonaro was out of office. But anyway, the deforestation rate went down, but fire went way up. So you have this confluence of different kinds of fires. You know, you have the fire of the secas, you have the fire of climate change, you have the fire of the arsonists, you have the fire of the soya frontier, you have the fire of the small-scale farmers who depend on fire to add nutrition to their soil. So you have a lot of different fires that are creating multiple causes to this problem of fire that can make, I think, you know, an entire biome go up in flames. And so the strong state, the idea of a strong state, the kind of militarized approach to ecological disaster it's more rhetoric. I think even IBAMA, which is the main environmental enforcement agency, which was gutted. I mean, it was stripped of people under Bolsonaro. I mean, these are the people that, you know, they look like this. They go out there and they burn these are the guys that burn the bulldozers. They find the miners, but their work has become much more dangerous now because under Bolsonaro, weapons have just saturated the country. So, you know, they're dealing with environments that are heavily weaponized, right? So that does inhibit their work in a big way. So.
tengo Cristian Mercenario.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación. Tenía una pregunta, como mencionó el Capacity Building Coordinated Acts, que son cosas que, como a mi parecer, las veo más concretas. Y me pregunto cómo ve usted que desde la antropología o desde las ciencias sociales se puede aportar a estas acciones que usted plantea, o cómo se puede aportar, o cómo usted ha visto que desde las ciencias sociales se ha aportado esto, porque como que usted igual plantea un cambio de paradigma o de forma de verlo. Entonces, ¿cómo aportar a eso? Eso, gracias.
I think, you mean in terms of the capacity building? I mean, again, there are many different ways to think about this. I think it is the work of anthropology to, I learned from my work in Ukraine two decades ago when I was a graduate student and I was studying the aftermath of this nuclear disaster. And I used this word apocalypse a lot. And then someone, a good friend, who actually became my husband, but that's a different point, he said, don't call it apocalypse, because these people are still alive. They have kids. They have visions for their kids, they're alive and they're figuring out how to live. And so that actually stayed with me for a long time, and that makes me resist, these larger kind of understandings of crisis, and where we have to find language, I think, to think about these what I call capacity building paradigms, and they're often underspoken. They're not spoken of enough. I mean, even for me, to highlight the challenges or the lack of correspondence, let's say, between the reality of wildfire in the US and the basic science of wildfire, that's already a political question. And, people talk about these things, sometimes at risk to their own positions. Not to me, but I've interviewed people who've lost their positions in agencies because they don't talk about this militarized version of fighting in a way that the agency wants them to. So we have to just keep talking to people, keep understanding how they themselves are knitting together, weaving together, solving problems, because they still have that time. They're thinking with the concept of actionable time, because there will be a time when they can't act, and that's different for everybody. It's different for you, it's different for me. So, yeah.
¿Me escuchan? Sí. ¿Me escuchan?
Sí,
¿no?
sí.
Muchas gracias por la presentación, la disfruté mucho, me pareció muy interesante. Bueno, toda la discusión sobre geoingeniería y el trabajo sobre esos temas, el contexto de los glaciares, y bueno, te agradezco, fascinante. Tengo una pregunta más bien sobre el concepto central que entiendo moviliza y que se nota en tus libros, ¿no? Y en otras publicaciones, que es este concepto del horizonte. O del hacer horizonte, ¿no? Generar horizonte. Yo estoy pensando, porque le vengo dando vueltas hace mucho tiempo, el poder de las metáforas, ¿no? No sé si podrías ir atrás una imagen que tenía del planeta avanzando.
Oh, the hothouse?
The one of the planets with a tipping point.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of
Sorry, I have to go through.
This
one?
Esa.
Yeah.
Y bueno, el horizonte es tal vez la imagen más recurrente en nuestro entendimiento del tiempo, en el pensamiento occidental. Está toda la filosofía continental. Y una imagen súper pedestre del transcurso del tiempo, de un ser humano bipedal posado sobre la superficie del planeta, que avanza y ve un horizonte desplegarse a medida que se retrae al mismo tiempo, ¿no? Pero yo me pregunto, ¿tiene el planeta, si vamos realmente a forzar el pensamiento, ¿no? ¿Tiene el planeta un horizonte? Cuando hablamos de tipping points, o del fuego, ¿no? ¿Tiene el animal del fuego que tú describes? en realidad está muy por lejos de la imagen de avanzar o desplegarse en una lógica de horizontes, ¿no? Hay algo quizás más complejo y no sé, dejo la inquietud ahí. Pero se haya entendido la pregunta.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that question. Yes, horizons are very deceptive, right? I mean, in my mind, you keep walking and walking, and it keeps going, but it also doesn't. You can deceive yourself. And so, in that sense, as a metaphor of control and navigation, I think it's one that I want to break apart, right? And you not only find this word horizon in Western philosophy, but also, in robotics. I was very interested in robotics, for example, and predictive robotics, especially on different planets, like craterous planets, right? And so the idea of a predictive horizon is that you can only predict so far before your program really puts you in trouble, because you have to be constantly shifting the basis of your coordination, the basis of your knowledge, in order to not fall on these clumpy planets, right? So even in engineering, the idea of a horizon is something that is, less metaphorical and more technical, in fact. And so that's where I was trying to think about this idea of horizon work. And actually, it came from the firefighters I spoke to, because everything of what they do is here all the time: crisis, crisis, crisis. And that ends up imposing certain, it limits their futures. I mean, just very practically, when you fight fire, if you're going to go all in with equipment and people, sometimes you want it to burn, because sometimes 20 years from now, that burn, that burn scar might help another fire from crossing over to another fire to create a mega fire. I mean, there's so many infinite possibilities with fire here, and how to use it strategically. So I think there's something about knowledge and presence with these phenomena, with these ecological phenomena, that is so important. The basic science of fire is so important. But I think the tipping point here is when, at least for me, this is how I think of it, is when people, agencies, they lose control of what they can know about a phenomenon, and it becomes something else. It's no longer relational. And so, this horizon of relations with these physical phenomenon and the implications for our politics is really important. So, yeah.
Hola Adriana, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Es difícil decir que si bien la disfruté, igual a uno lo remece, ¿sí? El contenido y las historias que emergen de ella. Estaba pensando que en el libro y en tus relatos emerge la pérdida en términos múltiples, ¿sí? No es solamente con respecto a la pérdida de un ecosistema, de un paisaje como la montaña, ¿no es cierto?, sino que también de vidas, de fuentes de trabajo e incluso de las formas de conocer y entender lo que ocurre a nuestro alrededor. Y me pregunto, a partir del trabajo de campo, cómo emergen las narrativas que resisten también a esta experiencia de pérdida, de dolor, de sufrimiento, y cómo aparece allí la esperanza o nuevas formas de cuidarse colectivamente en este nuevo escenario, donde también me imagino que emergen narrativas de otros futuros posibles u otros horizontes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I live with those narratives. I mean, that's what surprises me all the time, I want those I mean, I'm hungry for those narratives. I want to understand how you know, people take action here, you know, and I'm watching it now. I'm in it now, you know, in my fieldwork. So I can speak from that. But yeah, I do think that every loss is felt. You know, every silence. I mean, I was just traveling in around the Tapajos area in Pará, and the extreme drought, the second year of extreme drought, has meant that there's so many losses there of animals, animal sounds. But still, in these mobilization efforts that I was a part of, you have people who are still standing there and saying, yes, I understand all these interrelationships between climate change and me burning my soil and the risks, and let's work together. Let's think about how I can burn. I'm still in a poverty trap here, but I'll work with you. You know, I'll work with you so that my kids can stay on this land. I will do my burns in ways that will be safer. And so there's this coordination and collaboration that I find to be, I don't want to say hopeful. I never use the word hope, but people say that I never use the word hope. But there is something in time that still makes me think there's time, you know? So I guess that's how I would think of hope and time for families, children, communities to live on these territories. Because for the Salish Kootenai in western Montana, as for so many communities, indigenous communities, there's nowhere else to go. You know, they're not going anywhere else. So that is the critical issue here for them. And so in the cases that I've been a part of this past week, I'm quite I'm amazed at how people are still just last night somebody fought a fire in their village, and he needs material, he needs equipment, he needs people to come and talk to them about how to preserve their forest, you know. And so it is this time of collaboration, and it's not one against the other, but it's the decentering of expert knowledge and really allowing for different knowledge holders to enter the scene so that these lives, people's lives, can be sustained within the horrible limits that are imposed on them. Yeah.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. Una pregunta que tengo, porque me llamó la atención cuando lo mencionó, es que dijo que el conocimiento sobre los tipping points permitía como una influencia política. Entonces, en base a eso esperaríamos como avances en las acciones coordinadas, pero también mencionó una frase de Haraway sobre que rendirse parece ser la única forma de sacar de la mente como un problema sin solución, como un futuro sobre el que no tenemos control. Y en su respuesta a la pregunta anterior, siento que lo que iba a preguntar pierde un poco el sentido, pero quería saber si en el trabajo de campo que ha hecho para este trabajo ha sentido a la gente rindiéndose. Y cuando mencionó la cita de Haraway, a mí me hizo mucho sentido. Yo creo que es una sensación que yo en general tengo, pero pareciera que en la práctica de vivir estas experiencias extremas obliga a las personas también a movilizarse, o son otros los factores que parecieran hacer que la gente no se rinda, o si es que sí se rinden.
Well, that's quite a question. Yeah, I think the giving up, I mean, the idea of tipping point was generated by a lake scientist in the Netherlands 30 years ago, and then it was taken up by a number of different scientists working in different ecosystems to understand what Johan Rockström famously called planetary boundaries. So the idea that there's a limit to how much carbon, emissions, or nitrogen, or methane, there are these planetary boundaries. And this, at some point, I think, had some rhetorical, strategic sense, because it did show that there is this horizon, this fixed horizon, in a sense, in which life can change abruptly. And one sees that actually in many communities. I mean, and it does change abruptly. It has changed abruptly for many people. So that is a real thing. But these large-scale pronouncements around tipping points have to be more nuanced. They have to be mobilized in a different way, I think, to understand societal tipping points, social tipping points, how people are committed to reversing those dynamics, and the ways in which our own thinking, I think, can become complicit in those dynamics. And so, for example, with the case of fire in the US, or even in the Pantanal, people will say, the fire was so fast, I don't know where it came from. I have no idea. I have no idea what caused it. It was just terrifying. And then when we lose that sense of specific causality to a specific kind of fire, I think we really lose the political will to address these particular instances of, climate and, deforestation, everything, in its context. And so when people give up, that's the kind of surrender of thinking that I think Donna Haraway is talking about. And so that's where I think it's important to move away and not surrender the thinking of what is actually causing the political economies, the structural inequalities that are causing these specific, incendiary things, even if they're random, so.
Last question. ¿Se escucha? No era acá. Muchas gracias. Ha sido larga la ronda de preguntas. Tengo dos puntos, uno más quizás más específico, el otro es como intuyo que es la conjetura que rodea gran parte de tu abordaje. El primero es retomando lo de Haraway y retomando lo de la guerra contra los desastres. Ahí veo como una forma que eventualmente se podría abordar como una disidencia epistémica, como lo describe, en la manera en que hay ahí algo como un poco, no solo tecnocrático de la guerra, sino también falocrático, en el sentido de que hay alguna manera de interrogar en una forma queer, esa forma de aproximarse a los desastres en un régimen militar, guerrero. ¿Sí? Quizá hay otras maneras de atender esas, y que nos enseñen tal vez las sociedades indígenas, otras formas sociales. Bueno, ese es un punto más bien menor del que me preocupa. El punto mayor que veo que viene desde vuestro trabajo, quizás supongo que es la tesis doctoral sobre el desastre de Ucrania, y que ocupa la noción también de expose, o sea, vidas expuestas. Eso me hace pensar de otra manera la categoría. Yo creo que no es solamente metáfora, sino son categorías que pueden ser trabajadas epistémicamente, como la de horizonte, que me gustaría ver cómo dialoga eso con otra categoría que es filosófica ciertamente, que es la de umbral, que sabemos que la usa el viejo y gruñón Giorgio Agamben, que trabaja esas figuras de umbral, ¿no? Que ese umbral que atraviesa desde la Zoe a la bios, ¿no? Esa de Bare Life, que es parte que está en tu trabajo doctoral, que está en las crisis de alguna manera, que también está de alguna manera la noción de horizonte, y también de alguna manera esto de umbral nos lleva a una manera de centrar la temporalidad. Evidentemente, un tema, miro ahí a mi colega que trabaja el tiempo, que es devastador, porque la vida sin horizonte, o entrar en esos umbrales en donde se deja la vida humana, la vida vivible, la vida esa de Hannah Arendt, de la polis. Y en ese sentido yo creo que está muy vinculado a la hipótesis de trabajo inicial, donde propone esa noción tan paradójica y fascinante de la ciudadanía biológica, que no puede ser más paradójica, pues Hannah Arendt nos habla que la ciudadanía no puede ser biológica. Entonces tú propones eso que ya tiene su tiempo ya, pero sigue siendo una noción umbral, una noción horizonte. Que me resulta atractiva porque es una noción que nace de la etnografía y que nace de nuestros tiempos inciertos. Entonces me gustaría quizás que vieras de alguna manera, aprovechando que es como probablemente la última pregunta, que conectes esta trayectoria, que son desde tu primera, tu investigación sobre Chernobyl, el desastre, y a este libro actual. Que yo veo ahí algo en común, que puede ser en relación a estas nociones.
Yes, thank you. Wow, thank you so much. It's hard to make all the links logically, but I think for me, it's doing the work, but one thing that surprises me, I know for sure that the people that I worked with in Ukraine 25 years ago are the parents and the grandparents of the people who are fighting, an empire right now, essentially. And so I know that the people who I knew 25 years ago and still know, they were doing something completely impossible. Yes, they were biological citizens, right? But they were doing something impossible. They actually shut down a nuclear catastrophe. I mean, with their hands, with shovels and buckets, shoveling decontaminated graphite from the core of just things that nobody could even imagine. And so the unimaginable happened again, I think, with this war. And with other wars. I mean, the degree of brutality that we see, the degree of impunity that we see in many wars, in Gaza, in Ukraine, is just mind-boggling. But there's no other way. There's no other way but to fight. I mean, they will continue to fight, and it looks more and more like a global war because of various global realignments, political realignments. So I have to keep in mind that these are yes, people who talked about their biology, it wasn't psychology, it was biology, it was the measures of these thresholds of tolerance that their bodies can take to radiation. But there were these other thresholds that sometimes are hard to name, but they come into view in 20 years later. And so not only do I not use the word apocalypse, but I don't use the word impossible in this case. So in this sense, I think thresholds becoming horizons, resisting bare life, because after all, who's bare life? We don't know. I mean, really, is there one group that we can call bare life? I think many people are subject to this bareness of life today. And so I think understanding the ways in which these threshold figures come into view and the way we can think through with these figures, the horizons, the things that they inherit, essentially, the ways in which they understand loss. Because I think one of the things that is really interesting is that things get lost so fast that we don't even have a conception of loss. I think Hannah Arendt wrote about this in her work on futurity, that the inheritance of revolution was lost to the next generation. The treasure of revolution, the treasure of doing the impossible was lost. And I think there are many people who defy the bare life category that I think deserve us to be with. So anyway, that's what I would say about biocitizenship and bare life and thresholds and horizons. So thank you.
Muchas gracias a usted. Un gran aplauso, por favor. Gracias por sus preguntas, su participación y los invito ahora a un...